the morning of October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was handed a set of black and white photographs taken from 80,000 feet above the island of Cuba. And in that single briefing, the world moved closer to nuclear war than it had ever come before or has come since. For the next 13 days, a small group of American officials would meet in near continuous secrecy to decide how the United States should respond to Soviet nuclear missiles positioned just 90 miles from the Florida coast, while their counterparts in Moscow made an equally fateful set of decisions of their own. This is a minute-by-minute analysis of those 13 days, built around the reconnaissance photography that started it, the secret deliberations that shaped it, the naval blockade that defined its most visible phase, and the quiet, off-the-record diplomacy that ultimately, and narrowly, brought it to an end. The crisis technically began several weeks before Kennedy ever saw those photographs, rooted in a buildup of Soviet military activity in Cuba that American intelligence had been tracking with growing concern throughout the late summer of 1962. Following the failed American-backed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and against the backdrop of an American nuclear arsenal that included intermediate-range missiles already stationed in Turkey and Italy, well within striking distance of Soviet territory, Premier Nikita Khrushchev made the decision to secretly deploy Soviet nuclear missiles to Cuba, a move intended both to defend the island's new communist government against further American intervention, and to more directly balance the nuclear equation between the two superpowers. Soviet cargo ships had been quietly delivering equipment and personnel throughout September, and American intelligence agencies tracking this activity through a combination of satellite imagery, human intelligence, and increasingly frequent U-2 reconnaissance flights over the island, had grown suspicious enough by early October to authorize another high-altitude pass, specifically over the western Cuban countryside. That flight took place on the morning of October 14, 1962, when Air Force Major Richard Heiser piloted a U-2 spy plane on a carefully mapped reconnaissance route over the San Cristobal region of western Cuba. Flying at an altitude, the aircraft's sophisticated camera system was specifically designed to exploit. Heiser's plane captured a series of photographs that, once developed and analyzed by intelligence specialists over the following 2 days, revealed unmistakable evidence of Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile equipment being assembled on the ground below. These were weapons with sufficient range to strike targets across nearly the entire continental United States, including Washington, D.C., positioned less than 100 miles from American shores. On the morning of October 16th, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy personally briefed President Kennedy on the photographic evidence, and Kennedy's response was immediate. He convened, within hours, a group of his most senior advisors, a body that would come to be known formally as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, and which would meet in near continuous session, often multiple times daily, for the entirety of the following 13 days. From the very first meeting, Kennedy made a deliberate and consequential decision. The existence of these deliberations, and the missiles themselves, would remain entirely secret from both the American public and the Soviet government for as long as possible, buying time for his administration to fully weigh its options before either revealing what it knew or committing to any specific course of action. Those options, debated with genuine and sustained intensity across the following week of secret meetings, ranged across a stark and unsettling spectrum. Some of Kennedy's military advisors, including members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued forcefully for an immediate airstrike against the missile sites, potentially followed by a full-scale invasion of the island, to remove the threat entirely, and, as a secondary benefit, topple Fidel Castro's government in the process. Others within EXCOM urged a more measured response, warning that any direct military action risked immediate Soviet retaliation, quite possibly against West Berlin, and could escalate rapidly into precisely the kind of broader nuclear confrontation both sides were desperately trying to avoid. Kennedy himself grew increasingly skeptical of the more aggressive military options as the week progressed, ultimately settling, after days of genuinely contentious internal debate, on a considerably more restrained approach. A naval blockade of the island, deliberately termed a quarantine rather than a blockade, since international law technically classified a blockade as an act of war, a distinction Kennedy's advisors calculated would also make it easier to secure formal diplomatic support from Latin American allies through the Organization of American States. With that decision made, Kennedy prepared to take the crisis, for the first time, directly to the American public. On the evening of October 22, 1962, 6 days after first viewing Heiser's photographs, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised broadcast, revealing publicly for the first time the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, and announcing the naval quarantine that would take effect within days, a quarantine backed, ultimately, by some 300 U.S. Navy ships tasked with intercepting any Soviet vessel suspected of carrying additional offensive weapons toward the island. American armed forces around the world, outside of Europe, were placed on a significantly elevated state of military readiness, and Strategic Air Command was raised to DEFCON 2, the highest level of nuclear alert the United States has ever officially confirmed reaching, a state maintained for approximately the following month. The Soviet response arrived swiftly and defiantly. On October 23rd, the United States secured a decisive 20-0 vote of support for the quarantine from the Organization of American States, with Cuba itself abstaining from the proceedings. The following day, October 24th, Khrushchev issued a public statement condemning the quarantine as an act of aggression amounting to piracy, insisting that the weapons in Cuba served purely defensive purposes, and declaring that Soviet vessels bound for the island would not respect the American blockade line. For several extraordinarily tense hours that day, Soviet cargo ships, some of them reportedly escorted by Soviet submarines, continued steaming directly toward the quarantine line the American Navy had established, and Kennedy's advisors watched, with genuine and mounting alarm, for any sign of whether those ships intended to attempt passage through the blockade by force. Khrushchev, in the end, chose not to test that line directly, quietly ordering a number of the approaching cargo vessels to change course or turn back rather than risk direct confrontation, a decision that offered the first small measure of relief to an increasingly anxious ExComm. Diplomatic efforts proceeded on a separate, more public track as well. On October 25th, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson presented the U-2 photographic evidence directly to the UN Security Council, pressing Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin to confirm or deny the presence of the missiles in a tense, widely covered exchange in which Zorin repeatedly declined to answer directly, a moment of considerable diplomatic theater that nonetheless failed to meaningfully move the underlying crisis toward resolution. If this kind of precise, sourced, minute-by-minute reconstruction of a historical crisis is valuable to you, subscribing genuinely helps us continue producing detailed work like this. By October 26th, private, informal back-channel contacts had begun supplementing the public diplomatic standoff, and that evening, Kennedy received a long, emotionally charged personal letter from Khrushchev, one that appeared, in its language and tone, to suggest a genuine willingness to negotiate a resolution, provided the United States would offer public assurance that it had no intention of invading Cuba. For a brief moment, it seemed as though a path toward de-escalation had opened. That momentary optimism, however, was complicated considerably the following morning, when a second, more formally worded message arrived from Moscow, this one adding an additional demand: that the United States also withdraw its own Jupiter intermediate-range missiles already stationed in Turkey as part of any resolution, a demand that considerably complicated Kennedy's ability to craft a public response that wouldn't appear to American allies and to his own domestic political audience as a direct concession of otherwise unrelated American military assets. It was against this complicated diplomatic backdrop that October 27, 1962 arrived, and it remains, by the assessment of virtually every historian who has examined this crisis in the decades since, the single most dangerous day of the entire 13-day confrontation, a day that has come to be known, with grim and entirely earned accuracy, as Black Saturday. That morning, Major Rudolph Anderson, an experienced U-2 pilot flying a reconnaissance mission over eastern Cuba, was shot down and killed by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, the first and only combat fatality of the entire crisis. American officials, reasonably assuming that Soviet personnel operating anti-aircraft systems in Cuba would not have taken such a consequential action without direct authorization from Moscow, concluded that Khrushchev himself had deliberately escalated the confrontation. It would not be revealed until decades later, once Cold War-era archives on both sides had become more fully accessible to historians, that the decision to fire on Anderson's aircraft had, in fact, been made independently by Soviet commanders on the ground in Cuba, without direct authorization from the Kremlin, and that Khrushchev himself was reportedly furious upon learning what had happened, recognizing immediately just how dangerously the incident might be interpreted in Washington. That same day, an entirely separate and, in its own way, considerably more perilous confrontation was unfolding beneath the surface of the Caribbean, one that would remain almost entirely unknown to the public, and largely unknown even to Kennedy and his ex-com advisors, for nearly 40 years afterward. American naval forces enforcing the quarantine had detected a Soviet submarine, designated B-59, operating in the vicinity of the blockade line, and dispatched destroyers to force the vessel to the surface, dropping a series of practice depth charges specifically intended to signal that intention without causing serious damage. The submarine's crew, however, had no reliable way of distinguishing a warning signal from an actual attack. B-59 had been submerged and cut off from any communication with Moscow for several days, its crew operating in dangerously overheated, poorly ventilated conditions that had already caused several sailors to lose consciousness. Believing in the isolation and mounting stress of that moment, that war might already have broken out on the surface above them, the submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, moved to authorize the launch of one of the vessel's nuclear-tipped torpedoes, a weapon capable of vaporizing the American ships pursuing them, and very plausibly, triggering a wider nuclear exchange between the two superpowers. Soviet protocol required unanimous agreement among 3 senior officers aboard the submarine before any such launch could proceed. The political officer aboard concurred with Savitsky's order. But the vessel's flotilla commander, a second-rank captain named Vasily Arkhipov, refused, and his refusal, historians now broadly agree, may have single-handedly prevented the outbreak of nuclear war that single afternoon. Arkhipov argued forcefully, and ultimately successfully, that the American depth charges pattern suggested a deliberate signal rather than a genuine attack, and he persuaded Savitsky instead to surface the submarine and await further instruction. A decision that, once B-59 broke the surface and found the pursuing American destroyer maintaining a calm, non-hostile distance nearby, proved entirely correct. The full details of just how close that specific encounter had actually come to triggering a nuclear exchange would not become publicly known until the late 1990s and early 2000s, when American and Russian participants in the crisis began sharing their recollections at academic conferences examining the event's declassified record, a sobering reminder that the most dangerous single moment of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis was, for decades, essentially invisible to the historical record most people had come to know. With Black Saturday's twin crises narrowly avoided, back-channel diplomacy moved rapidly toward resolution. That same evening, October 27th, Kennedy dispatched his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to meet secretly and directly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, a meeting held deliberately outside the knowledge of several senior ExCom members, including Vice President Lyndon Johnson. In that private conversation, Robert Kennedy communicated a proposal, one that would resolve the immediate standoff. The Soviet Union would publicly agree to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public American pledge not to invade the island, and critically, a separate, entirely secret, and unpublicized American commitment to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey within several months, a concession the Kennedy administration insisted must remain confidential to avoid the appearance of a direct trade that might unsettle American allies in Europe. The following morning, October 28, 1962, Khrushchev issued a public statement announcing that the Soviet Union would dismantle and remove its missile installations from Cuba, bringing the acute, most visibly dangerous phase of the crisis to a close after 13 days that had brought the world closer to the brink of nuclear catastrophe than at any point before or since. The American naval quarantine itself remained formally in place for several additional weeks, lifted only once the Soviet Union had also agreed to remove a separate fleet of Il-28 bombers from the island. Final, comparatively minor point of negotiation, resolved by late November. The secret nature of the Turkish missile withdrawal meant that, for years afterward, the crisis was publicly understood, on both sides, in considerably simpler terms than what had actually transpired. A straightforward story of American resolve compelling a Soviet retreat. It would take decades, and the gradual declassification of internal American and Soviet records for historians to fully reconstruct just how much of the crisis's actual resolution had depended not on public brinkmanship alone, but on quiet, deliberately concealed diplomatic concessions, and on a handful of individual human decisions, Archipov's refusal chief among them, that had almost nothing to do with official government policy on either side, and everything to do with individual judgment, exercised under almost unimaginable pressure, in the isolated, oxygen-starved compartment of a submerged submarine that neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev even knew was in direct crisis at the time. What this minute-by-minute reconstruction ultimately reveals is a genuinely sobering truth about how close the world actually came to catastrophe across those 13 days in October of 1962. A closeness obscured for years by the comparatively tidy, resolved narrative that both governments were content to let stand publicly. The real history, pieced together gradually across decades of declassification and first-hand testimony from participants on both sides, shows a crisis resolved not through any single dramatic turning point, but through an accumulation of careful diplomacy, genuine restraint exercised by leaders on both sides, despite considerable internal pressure toward more aggressive action. And, in at least one submerged and now well-documented instance, a single officer's individual judgment standing between the world and a nuclear exchange that, had it occurred, would very likely have proven catastrophic beyond anything either superpowers' own military planning had fully anticipated. If this deeper, more precise account of exactly how close the world came to nuclear war changed how you understand this crisis, share this video with someone who'd value seeing the real, minute-by-minute history behind those 13 days in October.